Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our panelists and to all of the participants that are joining us here today for this conference on a better future for essential workers. We are now going to start the conversation for panel 4, which is focused on ending violence and harassment in the world of work. You know, when we think about work-related violence and harassment, we know that these have increased as a result of the pandemic that has put workers and employers in incredibly stressful situations at the workplace, even in their homes and families. We know that harassment has gone up. And often these forms of increased work-related violence and harassment take the form of being gender-based. So essential workers and those suspected of being being infected with COVID-19 have also been at risk of stigmatization, discrimination, and violence. So this panel, really, the focus here is to look at measures taken by governments and other social partners to address this issue of the escalating work-related violence and harassment, in order to build a better future for essential workers. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. We're delighted to have with us Mr. Claudio Moroni, Minister of Labor, Employment, and Social Security in Argentina. Sandra Hassan, who's the Deputy Minister of Labor from Canada. Joaquin Perez Rey, Vice Minister for Employment and Social Economy in Spain. Mr. Philip Simmons, Chief Ethics Officer at Sodexo. Shana Bader-Blau, Executive Director of the Solidarity Center, and Francis Anokpe, Program Officer for the Federation of Informal Workers Organization of Nigeria, which is a StreetNet affiliate. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here. Thank you for giving us your valuable time. So Claudio, let me start with you. You know, Argentina was the 4th country to ratify Convention 190 in early 2021. What mechanisms to prevent, protect, and remedy violence in the world of work is Argentina implementing, and are social partners involved, and if so, how so? Thank you for kicking us off. Over to you.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por la pregunta. Gracias
Hello to all of you. Thank you very much for the question and your invitation. Argentina has a long history in countering violence and harassment on the workplace. So we signed a resolution on a tripartite basis on this issue, holding a meeting which gave rise to a manual in 2012. This was a form of prevention of behaviors that involved violence and harassment in the workplace. Since the ratification of Convention 119, these measures have increased because this is an issue that has come to the very forefront of companies' efforts to ensure a safer workplace. So ratification of the convention ensured that violence and harassment became really very much a central part of our legal framework for employment. First of all, the Labour Ministry believes that there is no such thing as an effective standard if it's not translated into behavioral results. So we're working with the unions and other actors to ensure that these standards are translated into concrete results within companies. Companies are a form of community, and these communities need to work in a way that is more agreeable, more comfortable for all of the participants, all of the members of those communities. Otherwise, it reduces the productivity of that community, the community which is the company. We have developed a program which we call Quality 120. We have 10 public-private enterprises and 12 significant employers of the private sector participating. What we're doing in this program is providing information and prevention within companies. We also have a union which, as an employer itself, is participating in this program. one of the specific characteristics of Argentina is that more than 50% of our workers were made redundant during the pandemic. For workers, particularly for private sector wage earners, collective bargaining and collective action is important. So we have been incorporating clauses in collective agreements to counter violence and harassment, and we've also been working with union leaders, particularly female union leaders, because the reality is that the overall management landscape in Argentina is the majority male. So we've been working with female union leaders, providing information, awareness raising, and trying to ensure positive discrimination measures to encourage further female participation in unions. We have also incorporated a mechanism by which no resolution can be taken within our program unless you have at least 20% representation of the minority sex represented. So we are also working to develop a law to regulate the implementation of Convention 119 within Argentina under our constitution. And this is a tripartite effort to draft this law. I understand that, of course, it's also true that laws are not effective unless they are translated into concrete action. So at the moment, we are devoting our efforts to specific actions with companies to ensure that this happens. We're also trying to help workers that are vulnerable. I don't want to name particular companies, but the situation of workers in JP Morgan is going to be different from those in a large supermarket. The situation of the workers in those two different contexts is going to be different. The biggest supermarket chain in Argentina has joined that program that I mentioned, and it's a challenge for them and for us to work on all of this. So we're working on the legal framework and making sure that these standards are translated into specific conduct, specific measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claudio. You know, you mentioned that there's no such thing as an effective standard if it isn't translated into action. And for this, your comments really pointed to the centrality of tripartite cooperation that prompts concrete action. So Sandra, if I could bring you into this conversation, you know, we just heard about the Argentinian experience, and now if you could talk a little bit about Canada. You know, Canada is in the process of ratifying ILO Convention 190. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the government of Canada is working with social partners to develop an inclusive, integrated, and gender responsive plan to really take action and end violence and harassment in the workplace. Over to you.
Thank you, Sabina, for your question, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Global Deal Support Unit and the Open Society Foundations for having me. Today, I'm speaking from Ottawa-Gatineau on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. As Canada's Deputy Minister of Labour and Associate Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development, one of the Government of Canada's priorities is to continue making sure that workplaces are safe, fair, and inclusive for everyone. With that, today's session is really important and relevant to us. Canada continues to work with its social partners to develop an inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive plan to take action and prevent violence and harassment in the workplace. The landscape of our work environment has changed considerably in recent years and continues to evolve. But workplace harassment and violence, unfortunately, remains present. and has become more common during the pandemic. We can all agree that it is not acceptable, and we need to implement practices so that employees can work in environments that are safe and free of harassment. As Sabina mentioned, Canada is in the process of ratifying ILO Convention 190, the Violence and Harassment Convention. This is the first ever global treaty on ending violence and harassment in the world of work. It is timely, and it is also a relevant response to the issue. The ratification of C-190 is a top priority for the Government of Canada, and we are currently working with our provinces and territories towards ratification. Canada is proud to have played a strong leadership role as chair of the ILO Standard Setting Committee that led to the adoption of C-190 and its associated recommendation 206, and of our active participation in the negotiations themselves. Canada worked with all parties involved, including workers, employers, and other governments, to support the development of new standards, standards that take an integrated, inclusive, and gender-responsive approach to prevent incidents of violence and harassment. And we are very proud of that. To make new gains, social dialogue is absolutely key. Back home in Canada, it has proven to help shape concrete and effective policies. These policies include measures to secure fair pay and better working conditions, ensure access to social protection, improve health and safety at the workplace, and of course, prevent work-related violence and harassment. A year ago, Canada brought into force groundbreaking legislation and regulations to prevent and address harassment and violence in federally regulated workplace. We got there thanks to social dialogue. To ensure that the legal and regulatory framework responds to the needs of workplaces where they apply, we worked with all Canadians, employers, employees, unions, subject matter experts, advocacy groups, Indigenous groups, and health and safety representatives in federally regulated industries. We also developed a fund that supports partner organization projects that co-develop sector-specific tools and resources aimed at preventing and addressing workplace harassment and violence. These projects are joint between employer and employee groups. We believe that bringing people together from various spheres and with different areas of expertise is how we can achieve concrete and coordinated progress. Bringing our knowledge, expertise, and experience to the table can help us ensure that all workers across the world, especially women, are safe at work, no matter what happens in the evolving world of work. On that note, I do look forward to diving in further to this important conversation today. And back to you, Sabina.
Thank you so much, Sandra. You talked about sort of the importance of collective action of a lot of different social partners and social groups to come together to address these challenges that we're all confronting together. One of which is this rise in work-based violence and harassment. I'd like to now bring in Joaquin and get your take on, the government of Spain is also in the process of ratifying ILO Convention 190 to end work-related violence and harassment. So what role do social partners play in Spain? And in this process of ratification, but also, as we heard earlier, as Claudio mentioned, the implementation is ever so important. So what role do social partners play, both in ratification and implementation of the convention in practice? Over to you.
Muy bien, buenas tardes desde Madrid, Sabina.
Hello, good afternoon from Madrid. A great pleasure to be here, Sabina. Greetings to everybody, and thank you very much to Global Deal for this invitation. Could I also say that the annual conference of Global Deal will take place in the autumn in Madrid, and we invite you all to attend. The government of Spain has made the fight against violence and harassment in the workplace one of its priorities. One of the first public events of the new vice president of the government was a public engagement to Guy Ryder, the head of the ILO, signing ILO Convention 190, and we're taking all of the steps necessary for the ratification. We hope very much that during May we'll be able to deposit the ratification instrument in Geneva. Of course, an ILO convention involves a high level of social dialogue. Tripartite negotiation in the ILO is essential in the negotiation of all of the conventions. And of course, the ratification process naturally must scrupulously respect that tripartite social dialogue structure. So we have been following that principle in Spain. In Spain, we've been trying to emerge from the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, also trying to cope with the crisis of the invasion of Ukraine, a terrible current event, and finding that dialogue is something that really helps to make progress. Something that we have very much taken into account as we work to ratify ILO 190. Spain, along with the other European Union countries, already has regulations that were concerning sexual harassment and violence, and we have standards that ban discrimination on the grounds of gender and other reasons. But this current convention is extremely important. Everything it represents is vital. There are a number of elements which have already been mentioned and analyzed by Spanish stakeholders, the union organizations, also the employer associations, because it's very important to have a standardized definition of what we mean by violence and harassment, work-related violence and harassment, so that we are all working to the same definition, and so that the workplace becomes a place where you are safe from suffering. We need to have precise definitions, clear concepts. This is something that the social partners in our country has been particularly focusing on. And we feel that it's absolutely necessary. We're fully behind them. It's not just a question of definition. I think that Convention 190 establishes a number of major challenges that we all need to work on with the social partners. I think there are two fundamental challenges here. First of all, who are the victims of these instances of violence and harassment? They are workers, of course, but also they involve other kinds of relationships, and that's a challenge for our legal systems. They might be interns, they may be people who are volunteering in organizations sometimes. They're not always actors that are clearly identified by the legal system as employers, employees, or as workers. So these are among the challenges of Convention 190. We need to take into account these new protected entities, new protected people, if you like, and also it's not only related to the workplace. We're talking about work-related violence and harassment, so it might be taking place on work trips. It might be taking place outside the workplace, but in work-related circumstances. So where are we protecting these people and who are we protecting? These are significant challenges. There's another decisive element. How do you monitor these situations and identify them? As we ratify the convention, we're looking at the practical implementation, and often the victims of violence or harassment encounter practical difficulties in blowing the whistle, in informing people of their situation. That's another challenge to overcome. The convention is aiming to be effective, to implement protocols that are real, that take into account the practicalities, and that is a challenge. How do we really help the people who are suffering this kind of violence? How do we enable mechanisms by which they can denounce what has happened to them without fear of reprisals? Without, for example, fearing losing their jobs. Among these major challenges in the practical implementation of the convention. I will wrap up by saying that Spain aims
we will have adopted the convention, and we're very excited to have ratified it. We're doing it right now. And also the convention 129, which is another convention that's very important. This is what's important is we're convinced that by having by making sure that we have a workspace that is free from violence. This is important to adopt this convention. I hope that shortly the Spanish government will have fully ratified Convention 190.
Thank you so much.
The last thing we need is to go to Geneva to ratify it.
One of the many points you raised that stood out for me is how many of these instruments that we're now in the process of signing up to, like Convention 190 and other instruments, whether it's tripartite dialogue, social dialogue, to build workplaces that are free from violence, gender-based violence and harassment. In doing so, we also need to be mindful of how the world of work is changing and how precarity is growing and employment relationships are changing. And how do we come up with regulations that are moving slower than the pace of these changes? How do we ensure that these regulations can actually keep up? So, in that vein, now we've heard the sort of government experiences from Argentina, Canada, and Spain. I'd like to bring in some of the social partners. Philip, if I could turn to you, in the joint commitment that you signed in 2018 with IUF, Sodexo commits to zero tolerance of sexual harassment, both for its 425,000 strong workforce and for its suppliers and subcontractors. 4 years later, I'm interested in hearing from you about what the key lessons are that you could draw from your experience. What works, what doesn't work, and why? If you could share your experience with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sabina. So as an introduction, I will say that for Sodexo, essential workers is a key word because, as you know, we have more than 400,000 employees in the company who are daily busy with essential tasks like giving food in schools, giving food in company, taking care of patients in hospitals, and so on. So we are really concerned about those essential workers. So if we go back to your question, we have indeed signed this convention with IUT, the International Union for Food, in 2018. this convention to fight against sexual harassment in all the countries where we are present. And this is very important in all the countries we are present, because we are present in more than 50 countries through the world. Also important to mention, this commitment, this agreement is part of a global agreement that we have already signed since 2011 with IUF, because we are completely convinced of the value of the three parties' collaboration. As Mr. Moroni says, all the parties have to be concerned to reach objective. So our goal through this convention is to reach the zero tolerance about sexual harassment. This is a very ambitious goal, and that's also the reason why we need all the stakeholders to be motivated to reach this objective. So, as we all know, sexual harassment is punishable by law in a lot of countries, not in all the countries. Our objective within Sodexo is to go further than the law, so that all our employees can benefit from this protection, whatever the context, whatever the country where they are. So if we go more concretely to the actions that we have made linked to this commitment, the first level of action is clearly the educational one. We have to inform people, we have to communicate, to explain everybody what sexual harassment is, because sexual harassment can take a lot of different forms, and it's very important to communicate that. We have to train all the publics that we have in our company, going from the dishwasher to the managers. So this first step is essential. The knowledge of sexual harassment is the starting point of everything that we do. The second action point is the action point that was mentioned by Mr. Perez, is all the systems of alerting, because it's very important that everyone in the company can alert us about a situation of sexual harassment. This means that we need to have a lot of different ways and a lot of different channels to do that. We have, of course, the traditional channels through the unions, through the management, but we have also built the speak-up system, which is a system that allows all our employees to reach in contact and to mention the facts that can be problems. After mentioning the alerting, we give the guarantee that we will investigate all the situation. So that's very clearly an engagement from the company. We investigate all the situation in the respect of the legislation, of course, because this is key, but also to give this guarantee for the people. And as Mr. Perez said, we accept also the fact that some of the whistleblowers remain anonymous. That's not a problem, because we respect this. And the next step, of course, is in case if the facts are established, the corrective actions, the disciplinary measures that we take if the facts are confirmed, and it can go as far as a dismissal, of course, because sexual harassment is, of course, a very serious topic. So we have been in this commitment for 4 years now. We are very committed to reach our objective. We are very satisfied with the progress that we have achieved. We are also very vigilant, because we know that we have to be consistent through the company in more than 50 countries, as I told you, and in more than 20,000 sites where we are present. The last part of your question was about suppliers and clients. That's another challenge, and we come back to the shared responsibility. And by the way, a number of our clients have also signed the same commitment with the IUF, what makes things more easy. But of course, that's another challenge. We inform our clients about our commitment, and further we work together. So that was our experience of this context, and I will be ready to answer a question to share further this experience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Philip. And, I want to bring another voice in. Shauna, great to see you. You've been a longtime crusader for worker rights and, a crusader against gender discrimination. I wanted to ask you, the Solidarity Center helped to negotiate several agreements to address gender-based violence and harassment that were taking place in large garment suppliers based in Lesotho. How did that come about, and why is it so important? Maybe you could pick up exactly where Philip just left off in terms of, supply chains and kind of build on some of the things that he said from your perspective.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Sabina, and thanks to the panelists. And I look forward to the conversation. So I feel very privileged to be able to share the story of the Lesotho agreements, which are remarkable landmark agreements that make practical a lot of what we've already been discussing on this panel today. These agreements were signed among leading apparel brands, a coalition of labor unions and women's rights advocates in Lesotho, and a major apparel supplier to combat gender-based violence and harassment in Lesotho in the garment sector. These enforceable agreements link each of the brands' ongoing business in the that particular supplier. They link that business to the supplier's acceptance of and cooperation with a worker-led program to eliminate sexual harassment and abuse. The program features an independent complaint investigator body with the power to direct punishment of abusive managers. More than that, the program is not focused simply on compliance. It's focused on culture change. Thousands of workers at these factories have participated in intensive 2-day-long facilitated conversations led by workers trained in the subject about gender-based violence and harassment and unacceptable behaviors in the workplace. And these sessions empower workers to call out these behaviors and seek immediate redress by simply calling a phone number and not getting the HR director and not getting the company, but because the companies are often seen as having enabled previous abuse. And so instead they get this independent body called the Workers' Rights Watch with trained intake counselors who listen with empathy, investigate, and are empowered to implement and take action. And in these factories with these thousands of workers, we're seeing real change. Workers are using the system, and as they see investigations happen and discipline happen to abusers, and as they see workers playing this leadership role in the training and the facilitated conversations through their unions, they're starting to believe the supplier and the brands actually do want to eradicate gender-based violence and harassment. And so why was this important? These factories had a horrific history of abuse, routine demands for sex in exchange for paid overtime or for jobs at all. Very large majorities of the female workforce experienced this abuse, and for years and with total impunity. And let me just say that was not unique to these factories, nor was it unique to this sector, nor is this unique to Lesotho. In fact, in our experience as Solidarity Center working across the globe with workers in a dozen sectors across 70 countries, I can tell you with certainty that it's not unique at all. I can say with confidence that it's the norm in all of your global operations and across all your supply chains, speaking to our friends from companies here. And so the lesson we have learned in Lesotho is that worker-led solutions really matter. There's no way around it. Workers simply don't trust the boss on these issues, and they trust each other more. And so do binding contractual obligations. Voluntary codes of conduct are empty promises with no meaning. And if you're doing that in your supply chain or in your global operations, or if you're a government encouraging voluntary agreements, we're all going to fail. The truth is we need contractual obligations. And so, all the expensive consultants that get hired to advise companies on how to address gender-based violence and harassment, if they don't result in recommendations that lead companies across their supply chains and across their global operations to work directly with workers to negotiate solutions and come up with binding contractual obligations, and we don't have these worker-led solutions, we're just not going to make progress. And later I'd like to dive a little bit more, if we get a chance in the discussion, into C190 and more practical ways about how it really gives us a path forward as employers, workers, and governments. But before that, I just briefly wanted to lift up the organizations in Lesotho that have been heroic in advancing this work. They are the Independent Democratic Union of Lesotho, United Textile Employees, National Clothing, Textile, and Allied Workers Union, two amazing women's rights organizations, one known as the Federation of Women's Lawyers in Lesotho, and also Women and Law in Southern Africa, African Research and Education Trust in Lesotho. These Lesotho groups are heroic and doing amazing work and deserve to be highlighted. The three brands involved are Levi Strauss Company, The Children's Place, and Contour Jeans, who made this commitment. And the supplier is a Taiwan-based supplier, major in the global apparel sector, called Nanxing. The Solidarity Center provided support to these organizations for curriculum development and capacity building, and the Workers' Rights Consortium provided technical support as well. So we are wrapping around this program to help make it successful. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to highlight it.
Thanks so much for that, Shauna. I think these kinds of models that harness cooperation between partners, but really provide evidence of the success of contractual obligations combined with worker-led solutions, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think much can be learned and applied to other countries and other sectors, based on your experience. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'd like to, we've been talking a lot about, I think, the formal sector. And one of the questions we also got in the chat was about sort of looking for inclusive implementation strategies that not only cover formal workplaces, but also a wider world of work, including informal workers. And so with that, I actually wanted to bring our next speaker into the conversation as well, to kind of see how some of these instruments and which of these instruments are applicable to different kinds of workers that are essential. Francis, if I could turn to you now, and street vendors have been absolutely critical, during the pandemic. They're major point of suppliers for a lot of migrant workers, and yet they encounter violence and harassment in the course of their daily work consistently. Can you share some good case examples on how raising the collective voice of a group like street vendors can reduce their vulnerability to violence and harassment? Thank you for being here and sharing your experience.
It's nice coming up to talk about this. And I appreciate Global Deals and Streetnet International for looking forward to everyone to represent them. Actually, street vendors are exposed to violence and harassment at their workplace. But one major thing is, most of our workers, they hawk, they are in the marketplace, and they sell around the streets. And with this, they are exposed to a lot of constipation, eviction, extortion from the local authorities, and at the same time, we don't have access to medical health, in the sense that because of our vulnerability, most of our members, when they are sick, they don't have access to medical medication, whereby ordinary person that has malaria, instead of them going to the hospital to take care of themselves, they go and use herbals, and this always damage their system. And the vulnerability of violence and harassment has really made a lot of damage. And after we complete.
Sorry, Francis, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there's a lot of feedback, and I'm wondering if you could just hold your microphone a little bit closer to you, maybe. It might help us hear you better.
Okay.
So if you could just hold your microphone up, that might help.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, that's
like
much better.
Said,
thank you.
Okay. Like I rightly said, street vendors are exposed to a lot of harassment and violence, either from the municipal people, from the people that patronize them, from hoodlums, from even the clients that buy from them. And this has even made a lot of damage to the informal workers. For instance, the poor and vulnerable informal workers cannot afford to go to the hospital to take care of themselves when they are sick during the pandemic. And at the same time, they are being evicted unnecessarily. And there's no provision for them, no replacement for them for where they can easily work. And after we reduce this vulnerability and violence and harassment, this includes policy making, including us into policy making process, because we are the ones that are in the streets that know what pains us. For instance, you can't ask a formal person to come and dictate, to come and tell you what the informal person is passing through. So we need an inclusion in policy making. And at the same time, social dialogue initiatives should be included with the local authorities. We know what we want. Local authorities don't know what they are passing through. So, and according to Convention 190 of International Labour Organization against violence, it's very important because we have been recognized that informal workers should have a right. And by this, we need our people to be involved in capacity building. We should build leadership capacities for informal workers, especially our women, because most of them don't know their rights. They should be able to teach them their rights, what they need to do. And also, they should invest in public education, because most informal workers' children, they cannot afford private schools to attend. So they should invest more on education and health facilities that informal workers can afford. And for to court and tribunal for our members, because sometimes when they seize their goods, they take them and they will not return it to them. There's no compensation to them. We need compensation for materials and non-material damages that they normally incur into our informal workers. So, and there is a difference between eating and non-eating for traders. So we need a standard involvement in policy making, and there should be a kind of leadership training for our members. And in Nigeria, we have a lot of maternal mortality rates in the world, and it's very rampant in Nigeria, because you see all these underage children being given out for marriage because of the poor vulnerability of the parents. A parent who cannot afford to care for 5 children, having 5 children, they will now force the girl child to go and get married, and from there, they have maternal mutilation. So we need more involvement in policy making and dialogue, the social dialogue and initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks and enlightening us with your experience, Francis. I live in India, and when the lockdown happened in the as the pandemic came upon us, as the lockdown happened, street vendors that were particularly vegetable and fruit vendors, food vendors, were very quickly allocated as, categorized as being essential workers, because they were the ones that were delivering to the homes, going street to street, going to people's houses, delivering these food items that actually made, at great risk to themselves, everyone else safer, because we no longer had to leave our workplaces. And these are often the workers that are that are most affected by the kinds of asymmetries of power and the invisibility in policy that you rightly pointed out. And and in many of these different categories of workers, women often bear the disproportionate burden of violence, of harassment, and of invisibility in many of these kinds of essential work categories. So, with an eye to the time, unfortunately, we don't have time to go through each of our panelists for a second round of questions. But what I did want to do was to just Shauna, if I could quickly ask you, we have a question from the audience that's directed specifically at you. How can other factories, brands, and worker organizations replicate the experience of Lesotho? And you had also wanted to make a comment about Convention 190. So, if you could take a couple of minutes and do that, that would be great.
Great, thank you. So first, I would say just briefly that we need to move from these really good global framework agreements like Sodexo has with IUF, which is great. We need to move from there to actually negotiating at the enterprise level in the supply chains, collective bargaining, as well as negotiated solutions like we have that hold suppliers and buyers accountable, or whatever the power dynamic is with the, like in the hospitality industry, for example, with the headquarters and the hotels around the world and other locations. So we need to move from the global framework agreement, which is a great start, to practical, implemented in workplaces, negotiated with workers directly. We definitely need to hear from global brands that that's what they want to do and want to see happen and have that enforced. We also need to invest in systems that recognize that abuse is totally common in every country and in all of our companies. And so without 100 studies and 1 million expensive consultants, we need to recognize right from the start that it's there. And we need to invest in systems that sort of take away the power of HR and the company to enforce rules, especially in the beginning when workers don't have trust. These kinds of third-party investigative processes like we established in Lesotho are not super expensive to manage. They're totally replicatable at a local level. So that's really important. And we do need to also recognize that this is happening in all sectors. On C190, briefly, I would share that to my sister from Nigeria, one of the excellent things about C190 is it recognizes the entire world of work and all forms of work as sites and locations of violence and harassment. It recognizes the centrality of social dialogue to finding solutions, specifically collective bargaining, and specifically identifies freedom of association and the right to have unions as key to eradicating gender-based violence. So I would encourage governments to A, ratify, and B, encourage companies to implement C190 in the workplace through bargaining. And that's what we have in Lesotho is the implementation of C190 at the country level, even without ratification of the convention, it's implemented. So that's what I would recommend.
So, with that, unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't have time to go through all of our panelists again, but maybe if anyone would like to have a last word and respond to anything that they've heard, if any of our panelists would like to respond to something that they've heard from their fellow panelists, or highlight the one most important aspect and message that they would like to underscore or reiterate for this conversation, I'd love to offer the floor now for maybe a minute if anyone would like to come in. Otherwise, we will close. Sandra, would you like to? Yes, please.
Thank you, Sabina. I'd like to close on speaking about C190. And, the one key difference that ratification could make. We can all agree that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves a work environment that's free from harassment and violence, and where harmful behaviors are not tolerated, whether we take from the example Shauna gave us where it's institutionalized or if it happens on a less rampant basis. And I believe that C-190 will actually help encourage countries to develop and implement their own legislation to effectively prevent and address violence and harassment at work. But as has been pointed out by other speakers, whether Philip, Shauna, or our colleague from Nigeria, it will also be important to bring those principles down from the government level and into the workplaces, the various workplaces, and ensure that they are implemented and that we actually also have the tools to make sure that they're enforceable.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And Joaquin, did you also want to come in?
Sí, sí, muy brevemente.
Yes, just very quickly and by way of conclusion, I think that the key element of C-190 is clear. Our colleague from Italy has said that this is has said that something is very interesting, very important, that this should be translated to all the individual workplaces. To counter violence and harassment, this needs to be done. So C-190 needs to involve recognition of the rights of the atypical workers, men and women, so that we can absolutely put a stop to these behaviors. Just wanted to highlight all of that. And once again, thank you very much for this fascinating panel.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. Anybody else would like to come in?
Hello?
Yes, please, Philip. Please come in.
Yes, thank you. So we are completely convinced of all what has been said here. I will say mainly two things. The first one is we need this collaboration between all the parties because that's really fundamental. Everybody is involved and we need to have this collaboration. And the second one, and I completely agree with Shauna about that, is we have to build credibility about those processes. It's not because we have signed an agreement that everybody is solved. The signature of agreement is the starting point. And then it's to get into action and to build a credibility, to build a trust between all the parties so that the systems can really come to life and that the people can really see that it is functioning. And then we get improvements, results, and results for everybody.
Thank you, Philip. And I'd be remiss not to hear from our minister from Argentina. So if you have a last word, we'd love to hear from you what you think is the one most important message that you'd like to leave us with.
Me parece que el mensaje más importante es
to me that the most important message is the convergence between everything that's been said today, that it needs to be translated into concrete measures. There's been a lot of talk about the standards, but we tend sometimes to forget the concrete implementation. So whether it's collective bargaining, whether it's the state regulations and standards, one way or another, it needs to have practical implementation. The reality is that the violence and harassment associated with work is a more generalized phenomenon that can sometimes spill out beyond the bounds of these standards. Sometimes it requires a new cultural paradigm, a more integrated approach, rather than just thinking about the workplace or work-related violence and harassment, looking beyond that to violence and harassment in more general forms. So we are facing domestic violence in the home, violence in other forms of organizations as well. So it seems insufficient to deal only with work-related violence and harassment. One of the manifestations of dominance of one actor over another is violence and harassment. So we need to deal with it across the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Francis, yes, please. Yes. We will have you give us the last word. Please come in.
Okay. What I just want to say is I want to tell the Minister for Labor not to forget informal economy workers in whatever policy they are making, because we really need the minister, the labor movement involvement, so that they can include us in whatever they are doing in the next process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. I think that's an absolutely critical point to end with. We've had a very, very rich panel with tremendous insights that speak to the importance of Convention 190, but also ensuring that we look to a broader group of workers, because I couldn't have said it any better than Sandra, that every worker deserves to have a safe and nurturing work environment. And of course, tripartite partnerships and social dialogue, empowering workers and not just protecting them, but also empowering them to protect themselves, harnessing regulatory instruments, but also through worker-led solutions, as you pointed out, Shana. So with that, please allow me to thank all of our wonderful panelists, Claudio, Sandra, Shana, Francis, Joaquin, and Philip. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights. And we will now turn to the closing session for this excellent two-day conference that has really shed, I think, very valuable light on what needs to happen to ensure an essential future for a better future for essential workers. So with that, let me please introduce the ILO Deputy Director General for Field Operations and Partnerships, Mr. Musa Omaru. Over to you to provide the closing remarks. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Ministers, distinguished speakers, participants, dear friends. It's a great pleasure to participate in this high-level conference organized by the Global Deal and Open Society Foundations. The last 2 days have been very important. Policymakers, trade union representatives of essential workers, business leaders, and civil society organizations have gathered to acknowledge the critical role played by millions of workers who have been on the front line in the response to the pandemic. Most importantly, you have discussed concrete solutions to value more fairly the contribution of these who work in the essential sectors and occupations, including workers in the informal economy. These are healthcare and domestic workers, the large majority of whom are women, who provided support to the elderly and the sick. Cashiers and workers involved in food processing and agriculture who ensure our communities to stay fed. Cleaners, waste pickers, and those employed in the maintenance and the security industries. Transportation and logistic workers who facilitated the movement of supplies and medicines, and many others. The work has been critical to save lives and provide vital products and services to confined population. They expose themselves and their families to greater risk of contracting the virus, to ensuring the continuation of essential services during the lockdowns, safeguarding the functioning of our economies and societies. Yet, many of these frontline workers are in precarious, often informal, low-paid jobs and experience poor working conditions compared to the average employed population. They are particularly exposed to work-related violence and harassment and have limited access to healthcare provisions, social protection, and other income support measures. If we are to shape the human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, we can no longer undervalue the needs of these workers. And the most effective way of recognizing essential workers is providing them with fair incomes, safety in the workplace, and access to social protection. More fairness and equity for essential workers will result in a stronger economy recovery and will improve the resilience of our labor market against future shocks and crises. But now, how do we do this? At this conference, many of you have underlined that over the past 2 years, social dialogue has delivered quality incomes in very practical and concrete ways. Social partners have had a crucial role in advancing essential workers' rights on the ground, providing them with better wages and improved working conditions, contributing to closing social protection gaps, including for the informal and non-standard workers, guaranteeing them a safe returning to work and increasing protection against violence and harassment in the workplace. Actors and institutions of social dialogue place high on their agenda employment protection regulation, specifically targeting frontline and gig economy and gig workers. For instance, in France, the tripartite partners agreed on wage increases in the health sector. This was in July 2020. In Italy and Spain, the first national collective agreement on the gig economy in the sector of food delivery workers were signed by employers association or delivery platforms and trade unions. So we need to ensure that this positive example will be sustained in the longer term, and that we create a new normal where social dialogue and the respect and promotion of freedom of association and collective bargaining forms, this will form the basis for joint solutions that benefit essential workers and the society at large. As such, we need to promote strong and effective wage-setting institutions, such as minimum wages and collective bargaining, which deliver higher pay and play a critical role in lifting millions of essential workers out of poverty. In this context, the ILO constituents will be discussing this upcoming ILC in May, a general survey which explicitly addresses the implementation of conventions in respect of decent work for care economy workers. We also need to close social protection gaps. We heard from your country experiences that social dialogue can be effectively mobilized to develop, implement, and evaluate social protection policies and systems that cover the most vulnerable workers, including essential, informal, non-standard, and migrant workers. As called by many at the recent Global Forum for Human-Centered Recovery, there is a need for fast-tracking action to extend social protection to all workers. For this reason, the ILO and the UN launched a global accelerator on jobs and social protection, seeking investment to create at least 400 million jobs and extend social protection to 4 billion people currently without coverage. Finally, we can fully recover and build forward better from the crisis if we do not, finally, we cannot fully recover and build forward better from the crisis if we do not protect those who work in the informal economy and make up over 60% of the global workforce. One priority must be to overcome the informality and to promote a transition from informal to formal economy in line with the ILO recommendation number 204. As we heard today, social dialogue is a powerful equalizer and plays a vital role in supporting this process. Our discussions at this conference have shown that together we can make a difference in shaping a better future for essential workers, a future where they are not only prized by society, but are paid fairly and are protected. Inclusive social dialogue and social partners' action is central to provide all essential workers with a collective voice and advance their rights and working conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Musa. And with that, you know, I think the definition of essential workers must expand to recognize the many contributions of a range of workers. They are the backbone of economies, societies, and families. And recovery, resilience, and progress depends on building systems that are human-centered, that are worker-centered. And in this conference, we've had the privilege of hearing from a range of governments, multilateral institutions, and social partners on the centrality of building these systems that truly honor the contributions of our essential workers. It's been a pleasure to work with the Global Deal. Thank you for the invitation, having me as a moderator for the last 2 days. I would like to thank all of our esteemed panelists over the last 2 days, all of our participants, to the Global Deal and to the Open Society Foundation for their collaboration. And you know, we hope to continue this important discourse with you all in, you know, the months and years to come, to monitor progress and come up with new and better models to really build a better future for essential workers. Thank you all so much for being here.